Welcome to Chapter 4 of our series, trying to answer the question, are we heading to a dystopian future? In this chapter, we will dive into the pundit's favorite and probably the most abused literary work ever, 1984 by George Orwell. If you haven't read the novel, this would be an excellent time to give a thumbs up because I did it for you. If you have, this would be the perfect time to share it with someone who hasn't. And while there are a few spoilers ahead, if you find this book intriguing, feel free to use the link to Amazon or Audible to buy the book and support my work. Now, before we start, I must clarify something crucial, and sorry in advance for the rant. I will not abuse 1984. If you remember in the intro, I posited the idea that maybe we are but captives of our pattern-seeking, fear-motivated animal brain cranked up to psychosis by troubled times, forcing us to cherry-pick and connect random dots into a sketch of some hellish future we saw in a movie or read in a book. And this is precisely what people do with this masterpiece. And this is exactly what I will not. Not here or in the final chapter, where we will review all the works to answer our overarching question. Let me explain by example. In the novel 1984, the party brainwashes people to think that 2 and 2 make 5, that objective truth is what the party says it is, and rewrite history to align with the party line. To suppress, oppress, and control people, they employ surveillance and censorship, and they fill people's brains with contradictions to the point of helpless perplexity. Now, guess what? In 2020, James Lindsay had to argue with cathedral graduates online that 2 and 2 do indeed make 4. And why did he have to clarify this quantitative logic? Well, because an ideology that posits that objective truth doesn't exist convinced them that the arithmetic statement 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a Western myth used to oppress non-whites. Still stuck in 2020, we now know that in the early stages of the pandemic, a bunch of state-funded, institution-approved scientists colluded to hide the possible origins of the pandemic, creating the party's truth, and all dissenting views were relegated to the intellectual thought crimes of conspiracy theories. History lessons in bloody primary schools are becoming struggle sessions of people with different pigment densities. Entire chapters of history that don't conform to what the party wants you to believe are bluntly rewritten into lies. Just take, for example, a movie called The Woman King. That film took one of the worst slaver nations and terror warriors in the entire history of Africa. People that were responsible for the murder and abduction of countless black men, women, and children to be sold into slavery in the Americas and elsewhere. And what did Hollywood do? Well, obviously they portrayed them as progressive feminist anti-slavery freedom fighters, and history be damned. In the 1970s, the West developed a new kind of discrimination called reverse discrimination, which was discrimination. This then evolved into a new type of racism called anti-racism. And in the UK, The same ideology prompted the police to create a new kind of crime called non-crime. In other words, if you're not an anti-racist racist and don't reverse discriminate by discriminating, you might be accused of a non-crime crime. Oh, and do I really need to talk about surveillance? I mean, you're probably listening to me on a damn tracking device. And now, with the Twitter files open for all to see, do I really need to explain that wrongthink is censored? So, it's pretty apparent why 1984 is brought up repeatedly in political bashing. But this is all cherry picking. You can find just as many, if not more, dots to connect at almost any point in the 20th century. Now, it's the left against the right. But go back to McCarthyism and tell me how it's different. And why choose only these points in the book and leave out others like perpetual pointless war and state-sanctioned hatred? And why not mention that anti-wokes are voted en masse into parliaments worldwide? So, if you expect me to treat this book in such a way, to twist Orwell against the latest bad guys, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I will not do it in this chapter, and I will not do it in the final analysis of the series. And with that trigger alert rant, let's start with the introduction. 1984 is a dystopian novel abused all too many times by anyone warning of anything regarding whatever. Then again, it was banned in the Soviet Union, so maybe there's at least a good reason why people use it for bashing communism. However, being so widely discussed on endless blogs, podcasts, videos, posts, articles, and what have you, my review of 1984 will be relatively short and concise, meaning I will stick to the most important points required for this project, unlike for instance the chapters that deal with Brave New World and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. So, what are the basics? 1984 was written by George Orwell, an English novelist born in India as Eric Arthur Blair to a low-middle-class family. Orwell himself, interestingly enough, belonged very much to the left in his political and economic leanings, showing us that not all lefties are lefties. 1984 was published in 1949, a year prior to Orwell's death. Given the year of publication, the book contains obvious hints to the tyrannical despotic isms of the era, Stalinism and Nazism. As the name suggests, the story takes place in 1984. A few theories came forth as for the name of the book and the year. The most sensible one is that it's simply an inversion of the year at which he started writing it. That is, 1948. But you can do your own digging of the interwebs to find the less plausible reasons. The story of 1984 is set in a totalitarian superstate where the government is a single capital P party, presumably led by a figure known as Big Brother, that exercises total control over every aspect of citizens' lives, including their thoughts and actions. The novel follows the life of Winston Smith, a low-ranking member of the ruling party in London who begins questioning his loyalty to the party's principles and, by extension, Big Brother. Winston works in the government's propaganda office, ironically called the Ministry of Truth, where he rewrites historical records to make them align with the party's version of the past. The government under which Winston lives employs propaganda, strict 24/7 surveillance, censorship, and severe punishments to control the population. The bulk of the narrative in the book is devoted to Winston's journey of discovery and questioning of the government's principles and the true nature of the society in which he lives. Like in many dystopian novels, love interests are a key narrative driver. In the case of 1984, Winston meets Julia, who opposes the party's ideology like him, and the two start a secret relationship. Eventually, they are discovered and arrested by the aptly named Thought Police, leading to a bleak ending. Winston and Julia are arrested and brought to the Ministry of Love, where they are tortured and brainwashed until they fully conform to the party's ideology. And with that, let's define some key social and socio-political points from 1984. As you will see, the following are all closely related and intertwined, so the separation might seem a bit arbitrary. This bullet point breakdown will play a significant part in the final chapter, where we finally try to answer if we are indeed heading to a dystopian future. In any case, let's start with the geopolitical backdrop of the story: warring superstates. Geopolitics plays a central part in 1984, which makes it an outlier amongst its peers. So let me devote some time to it. In 1984, the world is described as divided between three perpetually warring superpowers, or more accurately, superstates. The superstates in the book are Oceania, Eastasia, and Eurasia, with a consistently shifting 2-against-1 alliance. Although, whenever such a shift in alliance occurs, the history is rewritten to say that the war was always against one specific party. To describe the geopolitical situation in 1984, let me paraphrase straight from the book. The two superstates, Eurasia and Oceania, were formed when Europe was taken over by Russia, creating Eurasia, and when the British Empire was taken over by the United States, creating Oceania. The third superstate, Eastasia, was established later as part of the ongoing wars. The borders between these superstates were in flux. In some parts, the border was arbitrary, but for the most part, it followed geographical lines. The geography of each superstate is described as follows. Eurasia comprises the northern part of Europe and Asia from Portugal to Alaska. Oceania comprises North and South America, the British Isles, Australia, and the southern part of Africa. Eastasia is smaller than the other two and includes China, Japan, and parts of Manchuria, Mongolia, and Tibet. What I personally find interesting in this description is that the geographic breakdown roughly corresponds to the dividing lines described in Halford Mackinder's and Nicholas John Spikeman's foundational theories of geopolitics. Importantly, these theories drove much of the geopolitics of the 20th century. For instance, Hitler's invasion of Russia is commonly attributed to Mackinder's assertion that whoever commands the main landmass of Eurasia controls the world. Conversely, NATO's containment strategy against the Soviet Union is attributed to Spikeman's conclusion that controlling the rimland encircling Eurasia is the key to commanding Eurasia, and by extension, dominate the world. Notably, as many strategists have noted, one needs mastery of the oceans to control the land encircling Eurasia, which indeed drove much of the maritime strategy of the United States during and after World War II. I think it's safe to assume that Orwell was aware of this, as he himself says that for the most part, wars revolve at or around the floating fortresses which guard the strategic spots on the sea lanes. All that said, it is essential to mention that this geopolitical description I gave is quoted from a fictional book in 1984 titled The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, and its writer, a Trotsky-type figure, had his own motives for writing it. Therefore, how accurate this description of the world is in question. In fact, before we move to the next point, it is essential to understand that almost every description in the book is subject to suspicion, since most of it shows what the characters themselves believe. And even those most inclined to question the party's propaganda are, as the book shows, not immune to it. With that, let's go to number 2, totalitarianism. The government in 1984 wields complete repressive control over every aspect of people's lives, including their thoughts, beliefs, and actions, as well as total control of resources and personal relationships. The government exerts control over the entire economy, including food, housing, and the rationing of basic goods. I say rationing since the shortage of resources itself is used to maintain control. But the totalitarian rules extend far beyond such matters, also reaching personal relationships. For instance, the government uses hate sessions to control how people feel about each other. But due to its significant role, I'll devote the matter of personal relationships its own bullet point after reviewing some connected points, such as the next one. 3. Surveillance. The party in 1984 constantly monitors the actions and thoughts of its citizens with surveillance conducted with 2 tools, technology and spies. In the case of technology, the government's surveillance relies heavily on advanced technology in the form of telescreens, which are essentially two-way TV screens, as well as the use of hidden microphones. In the case of spies, surveillance is conducted through a vast network of informants. This doesn't only ensure citizens are constantly watched, but also sows suspicion among individuals. Anyone might be a spy or informant, which is why no one dares to express dissenting opinions. Not that they would have such opinions thanks to the next item on our list, propaganda. This is the big one. In 1984, the party uses propaganda to shape people's beliefs and perceptions, making them compliant and accepting of their miserable existence. The most original aspect of the propaganda depicted by Orwell is leveraging confusion and contradiction, making it a form of psyops more than mere propaganda. This is why Orwell is used so commonly to describe the various bastard children of postmodernism, which is confusion and contradiction encoded in a philosophy. Anyway, the form of psyops discussed in the book can be simply thought of as thought control. the government employs various psyops methods for thought control. Most importantly, what Orwell calls newspeak and doublethink. Newspeak refers to the manipulation of language to control the way people think. In contrast, doublethink refers to the ability to hold two contradictory thoughts at the same time. The most famous example of thought control would be brainwashing Winston to believe that 2 plus 2 equals 5 through torture in the Ministry of Love. That said, I want to clarify something here. I've heard quite a few people refer to the famous Ministry of Truth slogan, "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength," as an example of doublethink. This is understandable due to the apparent contradictions in the slogan. However, the slogan holds internal logic corresponding to the party's ideology. There are a few possible interpretations explained or hinted at the book, which can be summed up as external war creates inner unity and peace, slavery to the state guarantees not being enslaved by others or by one's desires, and ignorance of the party's propaganda makes the state stronger, and a stronger state is a stronger citizen. Still, under the rubric of propaganda, we have rewriting history. Control over history is maybe the most essential aspect of the more standard propaganda portrayed in 1984, with books and news articles being the main aim. This, as I've mentioned, is actually part of Winston's job and is further reinforced by his statement. It was very unlikely that there existed anywhere in Oceania a copy of a book printed earlier than 1960. End quote. And lastly, in the propaganda toolbox, we get to the cult of personality. A large part of the party's propaganda is devoted to promoting a cult of personality around Big Brother, elevating him to the level of an infallible and indestructible deity. Crucially, the connection to the leader is also emotional. In fact, in the very last sentence of the book, Winston realizes that he loves Big Brother. Going on to the next part, we have at number 5, repression and oppression. Dissent and, crucially, individuality are not tolerated in this society, and those who defy the government's rules are harshly punished. For the most part, repression comes by simply elevating fear to a debilitating degree. Fear and intimidation are critical to ensure compliance with the party's laws and dictated customs. Obviously, controlling all resources means you can be denied any necessities should the government decide. But if that's not enough to keep you at bay, the government uses the threat of violent punishment such as torture and execution, or as it is called in the book, vaporization. This is usually the case if the thought police caught you committing thought crime, which Orwell describes as the essential crime that contained all others in itself. Importantly, unlike what the literal word implies, thought crime is about expressing dissenting thoughts. But the term itself is enough to suggest to you as an individual that by merely doubting the party, you are, in fact, committing a crime. Next, we have, at number 6, class division and inequality. The society is divided into 3 main classes: the inner party, the outer party, and the proles. The latter, which implies the proletariat, makes up 85% of the population, with only the inner party, a minority within a minority, wielding the most power and having the most privilege and luxuries. In other words, the political system in 1984 is a highly hierarchical kleptocracy. Therefore, society is unequal to the extreme, with a ruling class enjoying a life of luxury while the lower classes struggle to survive, living at or below sustenance level. And now, at number 7, we get to conformity. Everyone in 1984 is made to wear the same clothing, specifically blue overalls worn by both men and women regardless of their place in or out of the party. That pretty much sums it up because I already mentioned the repression of individuality. So let's go now to number 8. War. Besides the party's ideology, war is one of the main reasons to justify the government's authoritarian policies. Importantly, having a common external enemy serves to unite what one can suspect is a multi-ethnic or multicultural entity. Through the character of Julia, Orwell suggests that much of the war that reaches the civilians in the rear is a false flag attack, not to justify the war, but rather to frighten people. As Orwell put it, the rocket bombs which fell daily on London were probably fired by the government of Oceania itself just to keep people frightened. End quote. But the more absorbing part, as far as I see it, is how the war itself is described in the fictional book I already mentioned, The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism. Paraphrasing what the text says, it goes as follows. Warfare is of limited aims between combatants who cannot destroy one another, and there is no material or ideological cause for fighting. This is not to say that either the conduct of war or the prevailing attitude towards it has become less bloodthirsty or more chivalrous. On the contrary, war hysteria includes raping, looting, slaughtering children, reducing whole populations to slavery, and reprisals against prisoners, which extend even to boiling and burying them alive. These acts are considered normal and respectable when committed by one's side. But in actuality, the war involves a small number of primarily highly trained specialists and causes comparatively few casualties. End quote. Next, at number 9, we have intoxication. While not receiving as much attention as other aspects of control, Orwell mentions a vile alcoholic beverage called Victory Gin, which the state made exceptionally cheap but still rationed. Think of it like a pusher rationing an addictive drug, leading the addict to be under the pusher's control. But the gin is also used as a tool of control more overtly, as it dulls the senses and makes the population more obedient, sicker, and weaker. In fact, Victory Gin is used in the book almost as a symbol of enslavement to the party's propaganda. To emphasize this point, Orwell tells us that Winston drops the habit of drinking gin as part of his psychological emancipation, which is accompanied by improved health and overall well-being. And lastly, we get to number 10, reproduction and relationships. In this specific case, let me quote Orwell himself, since it's so overtly explicit and descriptive. The unforgivable crime was promiscuity between party members. But Though this was one of the crimes that the accused in the Great Purges invariably confessed to, it was difficult to imagine any such thing actually happening. The aim of the party was not merely to prevent men and women from forming loyalties which it might not be able to control. Its real, undeclared purpose was to remove all pleasure from the sexual act. Not love so much as eroticism was the enemy, inside marriage as well as outside it. All marriages between party members had to be approved by a committee appointed for the purpose. And, though the principle was never clearly stated, permission was always refused if the couple concerned gave the impression of being physically attracted to one another. The only recognized purpose of marriage was to beget children for the service of the party. Sexual intercourse was to be looked on as a slightly disgusting minor operation, like having an enema. This again was never put into plain words, but in an indirect way was rubbed into every party member from childhood onwards. There were even organizations such as the Junior Anti-Sex League, which advocated complete celibacy for both sexes. All children were to be begotten by artificial insemination. This, Winston was aware, was not meant altogether seriously, but somehow it fitted with the general ideology of the party. The party was trying to kill the sex instinct, or if it could not be killed, then distort it and dirty it. End quote. And now, let's sum things up. Conclusion. I think it's pretty obvious why this book is invoked so frequently. Surveillance technology has reached frightening efficiency. China's case is the obvious example, but it's not like the West hasn't had its fair share of privacy breaches by governments. The unique type of propaganda that redefines words, rewrites history, and bans ideas under threat of cancellation and even incarceration is making headlines in right-wing media and libertarian podcasts, all strong motifs in 1984. Politicians in Western countries are mysteriously becoming multimillionaires left and right, pun intended. In that regard, I would say that no regime in history was free of kleptocracy to one degree or another. Although, in 1984, it is obvious that Orwell is pointing to the Soviet Union. After all, how many times do you think Stalin stood in a breadline? Also, lately, great powers politics has made a comeback with a new Cold War on the horizon and a possible breakup into regional warring superstates, or at the very least, intranational organizations. Again, themes that are strongly echoed in the book. That said, given the rest of the book, I think we can agree that we have some ways to go before reaching the horrific 1984 dystopia, or even anything close to it. Other than maybe North Korea, China, and post-Chavez Venezuela, I see no other parallels today, while I do find many more in the past. It's true that unfortunately we live in a world with actual Marxist-Leninists in the West. Heck, the UK nearly had one for Prime Minister. But 1984 is so overtly pointing at despotic superpowers specifically that it's really hard to see us reaching a real 1984 type world anytime soon. Even an intranational world state would have a hard time. Look at what's happening in places like Europe, where populists flying flags of liberty from technocracy are voted in en masse. The one superstate that did come close to such horrors crumbled long ago. The despotic regime in China doesn't seem to be doing very well either. The Iraqi non-WMDs and the Gulf of Tonkin non-incident were eventually exposed in the free media, however captured it might be. And the narratives of the ruling class and their ideologies are being openly disputed within elected parliaments and on platforms accused of siding with the elites that have the power to bring such dystopias into existence. Please note, I'm not trying to draw any overall conclusions just yet. After all, we have quite some ways to go before reaching the end of our long march through the possible dystopias. And also, the entire premise of this project is to provide a more systematic analysis, less prone to drawing the target around the darts. My point is, however, that whenever people invoke 1984 specifically as a parallel to our own times, this should be taken as an overblown, paranoid exaggeration to say the least. Don't forget that Orwell did not write in a vacuum. He was noticing things in his own time and converged them into an endpoint in the short to mid-term future. And yet, we haven't even come close to anything resembling that. If anything, we have made quite some progress at distancing humanity away from it. True, some nations and socio-political ideologies do indeed employ control tactics explored in 1984. But I don't think it's the tactics themselves that Orwell is warning us of. Instead, if I was to sum up what Orwell is warning us of, it's the deadly mix of totalitarian governments fermenting a cult of personality that turn objective truth to heresy. No wonder this book was banned in Soviet Russia. So, once you show me a superstate that bans this book, then I'll be worried. Until then, do remain vigilant, but please don't cherry-pick Orwell's message. Now, if you have listened all the way through, I hope you will check the description to find ways to support my work, or at least give a like and a share. And with that, remember, don't do to others what is hurtful to you. Don't let the bad guys win, and thanks for staying to the end. See you in the next chapter.